Well, thank you very much indeed for your welcome, and thank you for the invitation to share some thoughts with you this evening. At least nobody's leaving yet. I think when it was promised that I would answer questions, the helpful phrase is perhaps that I will entertain questions. I don't absolutely promise to answer them. But I want to talk about a number of aspects of the interface between religious discourse and our thinking about sexuality and sexual health. And although I'm going to be talking mostly about my own Christian tradition, I'll be wandering occasionally across the boundaries into others, and there'll be others here better qualified than I to speak about those, I'm sure. But I want to begin with the very term sexual health and ask what exactly we mean by that and how much we include within that. It's in some ways a very modern term. I dare say that if you had looked at textbooks and discussions 100 years ago, or maybe even 50 years ago, sexual health as a concept in itself probably wouldn't have figured all that largely. But there it is now, quite clearly, something that is taken seriously in our discourse about health and healing, and that I think reflects what's probably an accentuated or deepened sense in our culture generally of our sexuality as an area where damage can be done, where humanity can be either nourished or abused in various ways. And the notion that we take responsibility for our well-being in the area of our sexuality is something which has come rather more into focus, I suppose partly because of that broader cultural sense that this is an area where damage is possible, where damage to oneself is possible, and where there are lots of complicated factors that we have to come to terms with in order to secure something like well-being. But of course, I use that word well-being because anybody talking about health these days will have to be reminded or remind themselves pretty regularly that health is something other than the absence of disease. Just as peace is more than the absence of war, so health is a great deal more than not actually having to go to the doctor. And so that's why I'm talking about well-being in this context. And that's why I begin with that question, really. What do we mean by sexual well-being? There will be all kinds of answers to that, and there are some very brief and practical ones, and some rather more complicated and philosophical ones. I'll try and steer a good Anglican middle course there. But I want to begin thinking about that just with a reminder about why this might be complicated. And I suppose in a nutshell, what's in my mind is that our sexual behavior and imagining, our fantasies and fears, our aspirations and desires in this area are so much bound up not just with myself as a body, but with all kinds of interrelationships of meaning and of power. And those two words, meaning and power, are going to be very much in my mind as I reflect this evening. What we fear, what we turn away from, often condemn, as in the case of paedophilia, is sexual behavior that involves the abuse of power. We shrink from, we think, unhealthy or irregular or intolerable kinds of sexual behavior and sexual relation where there is a deep imbalance of power and of meaning, where one person has the kind of power over another that leaves the other with no agency, no liberty to say who they are, what they mean. And so we're very wary, and rightly wary, of those behaviors and relationships which deprive people of their agency and more, which represent power at its most malign. But as soon as we've said that sexuality is bound up with power and meaning, and that the distortions of sexual behavior and practice have something to do with abuses of power and distortions of meaning, and the claim to tell somebody else who they are and what they mean, and so forth. Since we've said that, we recognize that our sexual behavior is always in some way or another, it seems, bound up with communication and consent, and all those things which have to do with human beings negotiating with one another. In my college at Cambridge, we now have a workshop every year for new students on consent, because we're deeply and painfully aware that that's one of the issues they're going to have to think about very, very hard and monitor themselves about as they come into this new and unfamiliar world. And that word, consent, and all that goes with it, and the notion of what we want to communicate to one another in sexual behavior, that's one of the things that makes our sexual behavior, our sexual lives, that little bit more complicated than just one of the many things we do as bodies. We can talk about other bodily functions in rather less loaded ways. Eating can be given quite a lot of meanings, and sharing a meal is in many ways preferable to baked beans on toast alone. But we don't somehow feel that issues of power and meaning are quite so much involved with our lives as eaters. But here is another very basic set of bodily functions, bodily relations and activities, where you can't ever quite, it seems, disentangle it, culturally speaking, from these questions about power, mutuality, communication. So I suppose one of the questions that we're always bound at some point to be asking in thinking about sexuality and sexual well-being is, with any sexual activity, what do I mean by this? What do I actually want to say? You can imagine a somewhat cynical respondent saying, what I want to say is that I want sexual pleasure, and that's it. But the fact is that there is, as I've suggested, no way of completely disentangling what we do with another person from those issues around power, and therefore meaning. So what do I want to say? What do I mean here? And that suggests, of course, that ultimately sexual well-being is not just a matter of achieving a good physical equilibrium. It's about a particular kind of integrity, a particular kind of convergence between what I do and what I mean. Do I mean what I do? Is the question which I think, in thinking about sexual well-being, we have to factor in somewhere along the line. There's a Canadian novelist called Robertson Davis who came up many years ago with a wonderful phrase that the meaning of the word chastity was having the body in the soul's keeping. Having the body in the soul's keeping. It's a phrase I really love because it says something about integrity, something about meaning what I do and doing what I mean. And if you assume that meaning is always something you're working at with other people, then you see that it's not just an individualist ideal. Now, that's the very broad framework in which I want to think about some of the ways in which religion works in relation to sexuality and sexual health. And sexual ethics, certainly for a Christian, is, in spite of the impression we regularly give, not just about a set of prescriptions of things you do and don't do. It's also very deeply bound up with communication. Because as anybody who's ever been to a religious marriage service will know, there's really quite a lot about what a relationship symbolizes. One of the very first things you hear in the Book of Common Prayer marriage service is that the marital relationship is supposed to signify the relation between Christ and the Church, which is a very ambitious bit of sacramental symbolism. In other words, here is a sexual relationship which is charged very heavily, overcharged, some people would say, but charged very heavily with a particular kind of communication. This relationship will show you how the relationship between God and the world works. So no pressure there, as they say. But if you look at various bits of Christian scripture, you'll see how that is deployed in different directions, how the foundations of that prayer book vision begin to be laid. For example, in the very challenging and rather unusual language that St. Paul uses in his first letter to Corinth. And for anybody who thinks that St. Paul is just a misogynist, this is a text to reflect on. He is a misogynist, but I think there's a lot more to him as well, in the sense that everybody was in the first century. But at one point, St. Paul says, the wife's body does not belong to her, but to her husband. And you can, as it were, see the heads nodding around his ancient audience. And he then goes on to say, and the husband's body does not belong to him, but to his wife, which is the point of real shock. He was saying something so profoundly countercultural in that phrase that people hardly noticed it for centuries. It was too big to see. But the point there is that he's talking about the marital relationship as he's discussing it there, as communicating something about a mutual giving or dispossessing, a moving beyond the whole notion of ownership. And that has quite long-term results. One of those things which the Christian church has certainly never fully digested until relatively recently. So in the Christian context, you do have materials for thinking about sexual well-being and what sexual activity communicates that are more than just a matter of forbidden behaviors, recommended behaviors, and so forth, but are something to do with what you might want to say, what your body communicates. And communicates, of course, inevitably in connection with and mutuality with other bodies. But Christianity's record in this, as I don't need to remind you, is a bit uneven. And it's something to do with the fact that quite early on, Christianity did internalize some very negative attitudes to bodies as such, and therefore to bodily functions like sex. The overvaluation of reason or intellect in some people's writing and thinking in the early church meant that sexuality was a deeply problematic area. You never quite knew what was going to happen. And St. Augustine has an extraordinarily candid discussion of why this is difficult. You never know, forgive me being basic, you never know when you're going to get an erection, says St. Augustine, and your will doesn't manage this side of your experience. He's talking about men, of course. That's, again, no surprise in the era. You never know what's going to happen. You never know quite where your body's going to come round and surprise you. And that means that this is a dangerous area. And therefore, you need to treat it with enormous caution. And that feeds into a general Western Christian unease about all this, an unease about body, passion, loss of control. You could say the very area of self-surrender, which St. Paul sees as positively significant, becomes in later writers an area of danger. Self-surrender, letting go, is what you mustn't do. So the history of Christianity in this is pretty complex and pretty uneven. But uneven rather than just negative. It's the same St. Augustine who seems to fret endlessly about this area of experience, who in one of his later works says that the embraces of man and wife are a foretaste of the kingdom of heaven. That there is something about precisely letting go in the context of love, bodily love, that is actually a positive sign. So he doesn't simply take on board a negative attitude. It depends, I suspect, which day of the week you get him, and exactly how worried he is at any given moment about what other people are saying. In other words, he's a human writer rather than a textbook. It's often said that the other Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Islam, don't have quite the same problems Christianity has about the body. And that's largely true. Judaism and Islam are less fastidious and anxious, less fussed about the body and passion than Christianity is, for a number of reasons, which would take a long time to spell out. They don't have any deeply entrenched worry about the physical as such, and they don't seem so worried about letting go, about passion. So the positive valuation of sexual desire and sexual passion is very deeply there in lots and lots of Jewish writing and Islamic writing. The ideal of celibacy and the ideal of rational control of your sexuality are not given the same valuation in Judaism and Islam. The downside, because there's no such thing as a free lunch here, the downside is that in some ways Jewish and Islamic approaches to sexuality have been historically more deeply wedded to patriarchy and reproduction than Christianity has been. Christianity, in spite of what some people say, especially in the Daily Mail, is not all about family values. In fact, early Christianity is often pretty skeptical about families. It doesn't necessarily have a huge investment in keeping the human race going. Judaism and Islam are much more interested in procreation, the reproduction of the race, for all sorts of reasons. But that can mean, in lots of historic Jewish and Islamic approaches, it can mean that what some people call by the terrifying title of heteronormativity, that is, heterosexual reproductive sex is the only thing, that is harder to shift in the context of Judaism or Islam than it might be in Christianity. I don't know, but that's one way of looking at it. Simply to say that although Judaism and Islam have, on the surface, a more positive appreciation of the body, they also risk something else. Christianity is sometimes able to break through that, but it risks the downplaying of the ordinary, the prosaic, reproductive business of the race and the positive valuation of passion. So I'm not saying any's better than the other. They all have their difficulties here. But it is, I think, interesting that Christianity so early on picked up this initially mild but increasingly troublingly serious allergy to the flesh and the passionate and the uncontrolled. How you'd parallel all this in the Eastern religious world of Hinduism and Buddhism is a vast question. But if I were challenged to think out loud about this, I might say, and this is really just thinking out loud, I might say that while sexuality, bodily sexual experience, is very frequently given an extremely high valuation in those contexts, again as symbolic of the relation between the divine and the human, there isn't a sort of central narrative about the commitment of God to the world that you find in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity that gives you quite the same focus on married sex as the center of everything. But that's just a thought. Maybe it's that. Maybe. So, moving on. We're talking about sexual well-being. It seems to me that religion is potentially both very good news and very bad news. It's very good news for ideas of sexual well-being to the extent that it insists, at least for all the religious contexts I've talked about so far, the religious discourses I've mentioned, they all insist on meaningfulness. They all pose the question, what do you want to mean here? They all turn their faces away from an attitude to sexuality which is mechanical, purely physical, bound up simply with power relations or control. They've all of them given way to those temptations at various points, but there is very centrally in their tradition material which says this has got to be about communication and consent and so forth. So at that level you might say religion is good news. It's one of those sources for talking about sexual well-being in the context of meaningful communicative, mutual behavior. And therefore, that should be good. But it's also bad news in some ways. By so often focusing on absolutely crystal clear, or supposedly crystal clear, norms of sexual behavior, by privileging so heavily certain kinds of sexual relation, rightly or wrongly, I'm not judging, just as a matter of fact here, by doing that, it's led to a culture that often involves shame and stigma for people who don't realize those idealized normative forms of behavior or relationship. And you won't need me to tell you that one of the biggest challenges in the area of sexual health, not least in the developing world, is stigma. People who are unable to talk about their issues of mental or physical health, or indeed issues about power and abuse and exploitation, because of the reality of shame and of stigma. And as somebody who's over many years worked with intermittently with the United Nations AIDS network, the issue that we kept coming back to again and again and again was how religious bodies could be mobilized to challenge stigma in this area, because while shame and stigma prevailed in so many cultures, it was that much more difficult for people to be open about their actual basic health needs as well as their community situation. And that's just one example among several. And again, I don't think you'll need me to remind you of the way in which issues around women's sexual well-being and physical well-being generally can be complicated by attitudes around shame, which make it impossible for women to speak publicly and witness publicly to various kinds of abuse or deprivation or disease or whatever that they're suffering. So that's why religion can be bad news. If it reinforces shame and stigma, it reinforces a culture which is inimical to sexual well-being, simply because it doesn't give permission for certain things to be named and dealt with. And the long-term results, concealment and corruption in a society generally, as well as actual physical dis-ease. I've sometimes said occasionally as well that this two-edged effect, the good news and the bad news, is true of religion and gender questions overall. Looking at the way in which women's issues are foregrounded in a lot of developing countries, I want to say that the best and the worst of what's done to raise the profile of women's needs comes from religious bodies. The best often because religion resists depersonalizing or instrumentalizing women. It accords a basic human dignity and a human liberty at best. It resists exploitative attitudes and ideally gives some sort of mutual egalitarian pattern that can be worked through. At the same time, we know also that religion, and I'm talking about a variety of religious practices and bodies, religion can reinforce existing power relations and imbalances, and can be very bad news for women. It can reinforce or sanction violence against women and various kinds of sexual exploitation. So good news and bad news with gender overall. But speaking as somebody within a religious institution, it seems to me that the challenge which that poses is the challenge of finding within various traditions those resources, stories, elements which give weight to the liberating or the dignity conferring side of the discourse rather than its opposite. All the religious traditions I've mentioned have, as I've said, diverse elements within them. diverse approaches to power and grace and equality. And that's why I think it's imperative to do the sort of thing which we were trying to do with UNAIDS and encourage religious bodies to quarry their own resources for those elements which would push back at these negative, unbalanced, unjust relations which other bits of the discourse can sometimes appear to sanction. But talking about these issues in the context of developing countries and economies leads me to a very tangled area indeed, which I certainly found deeply resistant to untangling in another job I once had. And that's something to do with the way in which a proper, well-grounded, universalist vision of human rights and human dignity, including what we would most of us regard as progressive attitudes to women's rights and reproductive rights and so forth, that can be coloured by all sorts of anxieties about an alien agenda being imposed on indigenous cultures. I don't know quite how you get this one right, but it's a very, very complex dilemma. In plain terms, if I, as an enlightened Westerner, walk into another society confident that I know what well-being and right relation is, what I'm frequently doing is reinforcing another kind of power imbalance, the imbalance of the educated, wealthy Westerner over another society. Does the need to work for gender justice and the well-being that goes with that, does the need for that outweigh the risk of giving another turn to the colonialist screw? Not an easy one to resolve. And as I say, not at all an academic question for a good deal of my time as Archbishop of Canterbury. But it plays out also in all those discussions about sexual health and reproductive rights that come up in the context of the United Nations Human Rights Agenda, international documents and statements about human rights and human dignity. It's one of the things that, in some people's eyes, fuels a kind of separation between the language of human rights and the language of religious faith. You will hear people, mostly Christians and Muslims from certain backgrounds, saying the language of human rights is inappropriate in our context, when human rights simply means the West trying to impose its agenda about sexual liberation on societies that don't want that. A gross simplification, but I think that is frequently what comes through. And I think there's a need to do quite a bit of unscrambling here. And I don't pretend to have any easy answers to it. But it's come through, for example, in the context of work I now do with Christian Aid as chair of their trustees. Quite recently, we were working on redrafting our statement about gender and sexuality, a position paper on gender and sexuality for us as a development organisation, in which we wanted to affirm very strongly a commitment to basic civic human legal rights for sexual minorities, especially for gay people, of course, who are so vulnerable in so many of these settings, and for the priorities of gender justice, which are very important for us. And to try to say that without instantly being seen as taking sides in particular debates within particular countries and particular churches. And this knife edge is one which I can see us having to walk for quite a while to come. But my point is simply that if issues around sexuality are deeply involved with issues about power, we have to think quite carefully about the power questions that are raised when we want to extend or promote what many of us would call a liberalizing agenda in other cultures. not wholly straightforward. And I think one of the more uncomfortable evenings of my life was when I found myself having dinner with an African president, who'd better be nameless, who after a slightly formal discussion over dinner pushed his chair back and said, "Now, what's all this about gay sex in the church?" And the next hour or so is not one that I remember with any great enjoyment. But if you are thinking about these things, as I say, in relation to power, then those intercultural questions of power come up as well. And especially in religious contexts, they very much complicate the story. A word about my time as Archbishop in connection with all this, because it's impossible to be impersonal about it all. I was, I think, a bit taken aback by the way in which issues around gender and sexuality totally dominated the 10 years or so I was Archbishop. I had this curious old-fashioned idea that maybe these were questions that were not of first-order importance for religious identity, and that it was possible to disagree intelligently and charitably about them. I learned rather rapidly how wrong I was about that. But it left me with a lot of questions about why exactly these were questions that came up so forcefully. I won't talk in this context primarily about the gender equality issues within the church, the issues of women's ordination and women bishops that came up, but a bit more about issues around the rights and dignities of LGBT people as that emerged in controversy. The first thing which I realized is precisely the point I've just made. For whatever reasons, the promotion or support of a more accepting attitude to LGBT people in the church was regarded, or could be presented as, a capitulation to a particular phase of Western society which sought to imprint itself without consultation on the rest of the world. And while it certainly suited some very astute politicians within the church to present the question in these terms, there was a genuine unease about it. And I can remember a conversation in Tanzania with a very ordinary working man who was working on the ferry to Zanzibar. And I got into conversation with him. And he said, basically, well, why is it that you're telling us we have to do this? Because this puts us at a great disadvantage here. None of the other churches are doing this, and of course the Muslims don't like it. And that was an unprompted remark from somebody with no particular axe to grind. And while I'm not using that as an alibi for doing nothing or changing the agenda, I simply mark it as one of those things that complicates the picture. That was one thing. The other thing which I came to realize, a more uncomfortable point in a way, is that precisely because sexual behavior and identity carries so much symbolic meaning and freight, if you feel you're losing arguments culturally about sexual behavior and sexual ethics, you may very well find yourself giving disproportionate importance to those areas where you haven't yet lost the argument. Let me put it this way, and again, I'm being as candid as I can be about this. I hope it's not too shocking. Largely, Christians and others are likely to feel they've lost the cultural argument, for example, about sex before marriage, with the whole generation, as they've lost the cultural argument about divorce and remarriage a generation before. The next argument, which 10 years ago it looked as if we might lose, was the argument about LGBT people and the argument about same-sex relations. I think many people said if we've lost two major arguments, we're going to dig our heels in over the third. so that resistance to any change in ethical approaches to people of same-sex orientation and practice, that took on a disproportionate importance because it was the last ditch. Again, I'm not talking about whether we should or shouldn't have lost the arguments or changed, but just about the facts. And I suspect that that sense of this being the last redoubt, the last trench, was quite important for quite a lot of people, and is quite important for quite a lot of people. We forget how rapidly the climate has changed in this respect. 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't obvious that the cultural argument about same-sex relations had been lost by traditional views. That we now have legal same-sex marriage in this country is a change which happened really very, very rapidly. And I think even 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it wouldn't have been predictable that this would have been seen by so many people as an obvious next step. So 10, 15 years ago, I think this might have felt like a position culturally, socially, still defensible. And certainly in terms of theology and religious attitudes, still defensible. So looking back over 10 years, 10 years which were never dull in this respect, of intermittent argument about these issues, those two questions were the ones which I saw as driving quite a lot of the feeling around this. An understandable and quite complex unease about global relations of power, rich and poor, north and south, and an unease about the sense that symbolic, meaning-related power in our own society was slipping away from the grasp of religious people, and we needed to hang on to what we could. You see why I warned you at the beginning that issues of power and meaning were going to keep coming back in this presentation, because these things are very much about those central questions. So, in general, talking about the relation between sexual health, sexuality, and religion, I find myself looking at the whole field and saying, I would deeply hope that some bits of the religious tradition still have the capacity to challenge and enrich and enlarge an approach to sexual health and sexuality. Above all, that religious commitment shared between so many traditions, that religious commitment to a sense that what we do with our bodies is, in this respect, communicative, symbolic, significant. Because unless we have some notion of what we want to say with our bodies in sexual relations as in other kinds of relation, then we are in danger of slipping towards what I called earlier a mechanical and impersonal picture of sexual well-being, just calibrating the things that give you an equilibrium, a sense of physical satisfaction. And sexuality has never sat comfortably with that rather limited account of how it works and how it impinges on people's imagination. So that's one of the positives. I sense also that the whole world of discourse about sexual well-being and sexuality as it's working out in our contemporary society is going to go on being very unsettling for most religious communities. That's partly because there are things with which we haven't caught up, quite simply, especially in the area of gender justice and in the area of what I called legal and civil dignities for LGBT people. But there is also the unease of whether that means we change our fundamental ethical attitudes within the Church on some of these questions, especially on the possibility of sanctioned same-sex relationships. And this is a debate which is not going to end quickly in any of the churches. My own church, the Anglican Church, is notoriously given to washing its dirty linen in public and quarrelling as baroquely and publicly as possible on this. And nasty as that is to live in the middle of, it's probably quite a good thing, because I don't think any church is going to be able to sit on this question and suppress it indefinitely. How other religious traditions confront these issues and cope with them, I don't know. And my sense is that within different families of Judaism, there is already a fair bit of debate emerging on this, and some flickers of a debate within the Islamic world, though for all kinds of understandable reasons, that's again bound up with issues about cultural power, advantage and disadvantage, and is not moving in the same directions necessarily as elsewhere. So yes, I want to see religious resource being available in our thinking on this subject, and yes, I think religious communities, religious leaders and thinkers have to digest what the culture is saying and then confront that awkward question. So does this mean we've been wrong in our actual ethical statements? But to me, the most central thing in all this is to hold on to some notion that sexual health, sexual well-being, is a matter to do with integrity. That is to say, someone who claims or aspires to sexual well-being is, I hope, somebody who is able to say that they have the body in the soul's keeping, that what they do is what they mean, and that meaning is not bound up with power, domination, control, abuse, and so forth. To keep that sense of the priority of integrity alive and robust and three-dimensional, I think religious discourse is potentially a really important partner. But it's a conversation in which both sides need to be asking critical and sharp questions of each other. It's an area which is not going to resolve itself into simple consensus anytime soon. But it's an area which deserves, I think, the deepest and the most patient kind of engagement. And I rather hope that the chance to talk a little bit about it this evening may be some small contribution to that patience and that attention which the subject deserves. So thank you very much.